Hi there, and welcome to this Mad Sense video in which I answer some of the what to believe questions about hearing voices and madness. In this video, I want to show you how variations in the phenomenology can create the experiences of being a psychic or being psychotic and even a prophet. And that actually, these are variations on a theme based on a connection, either between us as humans or between us and some other world. It's this kind of idea that I've mentioned before, with sort of voices talking, saying this kind of thing. Greggy boy, you can't swear on the web. They're asserting that there is, some kind of connection between us as humans, between us and voices, or whatever this phenomenon is. And of course that they have some kind of role in this web in terms of how information is actually redistributed. And actually, I'll also show you that it's actually the shift from one to the other, whether you're psychic, psychotic, or a prophet, turns on seemingly minor nuances that are kind of lost in the the confusion and complexity of how the phenomenon presents all this information. Just a quick comment on these numbers. I don't know how many people there are globally who would consider themselves psychic. I would guess it's somewhere probably in the low tens of thousands. That's just a guess. I don't know that there are any studies about that. Of course, the number of people who hear voices that have been considered prophets is actually very, very small. And of course, I'll show you why in this exercise. The thing, of course, to remember is that by far the majority of people who experience this thing experience it as distressing. And, estimates vary, but there are, sort of roughly 300 million people globally that experience this phenomenon in an unpleasant way. So what I want to talk about in this video are firstly, that the idea of whether we're kind of psychic, psychotic, or a prophet, in terms of our experience of this thing, what each of those experiences shares this idea of some kind of connection between us that has sort of unknown qualities, and of course our experience in general of some sort of connection between humans and some other world is actually quite common. They're all expressed very differently in different environments and different sort of cultures, because they're the answers and that we derive from experience of it are quite different. And of course, the beliefs that we form from those answers are quite different. But what I want to do is show you that we can actually simplify that wide variety of answers by looking at the questions that this phenomenon provokes. The questions we ask are surprisingly predictable, even though, say, the answers that we reach might, of course, be very, very different. And I say, by looking at the questions, you can reduce the variety and the confusion and complexity. Then what I'm going to do is summarize three different states, I suppose, of the phenomenology. Certainly, my phenomenology changed through my experience of it. Voices, or whatever this phenomenon is, proactively changed it to lead me in particular directions, and that's what I will actually show you. And I'm just going to sort of freeze three states, if you like, that sort of relate to each of these three experiences in some way. And then I'm going to, from that sort of slightly more static picture, I'm going to put that sort of in motion and sort of fast forward it, and then show you how small changes in terms of what voices say, really, or how they change aspects of the phenomenology, shift, make the whole experience sort of turn on what is really just a nuance that we're losing in the sort of confusion and complexity of it. And what I'll do from that is actually show you that it's about the phenomenology and not about the individual. And then, of course, the result of that experience is actually how we translate that experience of the phenomenology is, of course, how we fast forward that into the implications for us in life. And I want to just give you a little insight to that. And then I'll summarize as usual, with one or two slides. with one or two kind of takeaway points, and I'll show you how actually it's the phenomenon that leads us towards particular beliefs. And in the summary, I'll show you that actually it's our emotional response to it that is more important than the answers that we're reaching. So hub beliefs have very many expressions, and really what I want to do is just give you something here that pretty much everybody will relate to in some way or another. And of course, I do this with respect because I recognize that beliefs are things we feel emotional about. What I want to do is remind you, of course, that beliefs are not truths. They're just our interpretation of little pieces of evidence, typically in fields where we lack evidence. And of course, one of the most common beliefs, if you like, in some kind of hub connection is this idea of ancestors, which I'm representing with this, with sort of family in the cloud, so on to another description visually. And of course, the way we sort of, the way I think about, how this sort of belief comes about is that actually our mind is predictive. So we don't live our lives thinking we're not going to be here tomorrow. We live our lives assuming that the sun will come up tomorrow for us. Of course, we know that one day it won't. We just don't really think about that much until perhaps we're sort of in an end of life in an end of life phase. But I think really our mind is predictive. So when someone we love actually passes on or dies, I think we observe that life goes on around us because we're continuing, and the people sort of around us are carrying on. So it's life that goes on, which doesn't necessarily mean that the life of an individual goes on. But I think that's what's sort of confusing us. And we exacerbate that confusion, I think, by creating mythical stories to tell our children, because really we don't want to tell our children that grandma is no more. Because actually, of course, grandma lives on in our memories, and of course, those are very, very happy memories for most of us. And of course, so what we do is we're quite happy to delude ourselves. And I think, so what's happening is, it's quite understandable that, some 2/3 or something of the world's population, have some kind of belief in something other. And of course, the whole idea of, that something other, including our ancestors, our family, sort of watching over us, is how we might describe it. Because of course they have, grandmothers, certainly my grandmothers were very protective, over us kids, grandkids to them. So of course we see them as observing us, and of course this idea of observing that they're now in this spirit realm, of course, and can sort of know more about us and know our thinking. So of course this observing and knowing are things that we sort of confuse. We confuse quite easily. So what I want to do is just point out here that this sort of observing, if you like, is this idea that there's people, ancestors in this other space, observing kind of what we're doing, which is them looking at us, if you like. And I say, of course, that very easily shifts to this idea of knowing. So of course, what I'm doing and thinking, of course, is shared, of course, with with our ancestors, if that's your version of the kind of belief of it. What I just want to remind you here actually is, of course, that these are beliefs. They are not facts or truths. As I say, they're cutesy stories, but actually we have no evidence of it. And I'll show you later on that actually I think we want to ask ourselves whether these things are actually doing us any good. And of course, in particular, what I want to do is show you what happens when this phenomenology that I represent as this jack in the box comes along and inserts itself in the middle of this hub, or seems to do, and then claims to have power over this sort of observing and knowing. And of course, this is really how the experiences of being a psychic, psychotic, or even a prophet have actually arisen. So what I want to do here is sort of focus on the questions, rather than the questions that this jack in the box provokes, rather than the answers. And of course, what the questions do is, because we have a limited number of them, they offer us a way to sort of theme our answers. So it's kind of a way of doing a sort of thematic grouping, if you like, of the answers that we reach, which just gives us a much simpler way to understand them and to reduce the variety. So what I want to do is kind of show you that actually the provoked question and answer session, when we're exposed to something unusual, is very, very predictable and very logical. I'll show you. So what happens is, here I am minding my own business. Along comes this something unusual. Okay, in this case, this something unusual is this phenomenon that we're calling hearing voices and extreme states. And of course, what this does is it engages my mind in this question and answer session. And of course, I'm asking questions. And of course, the very first question I'm going to ask is, what is it? Because this is something that's unusual, that's presented. As I say, typically, because it's unusual, it's sort of out of context. So I have no context for assessing it. So of course, the first question I do is I try and identify it in some way. And of course, if it happens to be a voice that I'm hearing, or two voices that I'm hearing, as was the case with me in the beginning, of course, I very logically ask the question, who? And of course, these are just variations on the same question, what and who. I'm just, who is the same is the question when the what is a person. But of course, this is us just simply identifying what this object is, because of course that tells us more about what it actually means. So of course, in this case, we can't answer the question what, or certainly. So when I first heard the sound of two people talking about what I was doing, so I identified them as my neighbors. So the what was people, two people, the who was neighbors. Later on, I went to the doctor, and of course, he described what I was experiencing as auditory hallucinations. And I had a completely different answer to plug into the what question, which of course then prompted the next question, well, how is this happening? And regardless of the answer we reach, the thing that all those how questions share is the answer that it's happening differently, because I'm experiencing it and the majority of people are not. Therefore, there's something different about it. So of course, I then ask the question, well, why? Why is it different? Is the first question I'm very logically going to ask. And then of course, because it's happening to me and not to you, the very next question I ask is, why me? Because obviously it might have something to do with me. If I don't find a general explanation for the question why, I make it more specific. Of course, I bring it down to me. It's just a very logical progression. And then, of course, I may well find an answer for why me. I'll say the difference is, for example, I'm a psychic. So this is a very, very predictable series of questions. Even if we don't ask them strictly in that sequence, sooner or later, those are the 5 questions that we will actually ask. It's who, what, why, and how. And of course, the answers that we reach are varied. But of course, what does happen in this kind of case in particular is, because this is unusual, and we start to ask people around us, because that's our next best source of information. So we can observe this thing and how it's behaving, number one. And of course, because it's unusual, we kind of say, well, has anybody else experienced this? What do we know? What does anybody else know about it? So of course, we ask the people around us. And so of course, the context that we're answering the questions in often becomes our culture. And at least in present day language, the kind of dominant themes of sort of context and culture, are the idea that actually this might mean that I'm a psychic or a shaman, where a psychic is just an individual who might be offering their kind of services, if you like, as being in touch with this other, whereas a shaman is typically chosen, either by the tribe or community, or sometimes by the mere fact that they hear voices, to play a role in the community. Of course, another very common interpretation of this, of course, is spiritual and religious. Whereas, of course, spiritual is just, again, the same idea. It's other, based on that belief in ancestors, or actually for me, warming to the idea that life goes on. We're interpreting as possibly meaning that there is an afterlife. Is this kind of idea of spirituality, if you like, the connection to other. And then, of course, the religions, or the revealed religions, very specific interpretations within that space, where voices themselves have played a very active role in defining what those beliefs actually are. And I'll show you that as we go through this thing. And then, of course, the other one that's derived primarily from the psychotic experience of it is that we're mentally ill. And this, in terms of our history, is probably relatively recent. 100 years old might, it's several generations, but I mean, conceptually, it's relatively recent. But of course, if you look at the Hearing Voices movement in particular, there's quite a big group in there who, of course, are objecting to the definition of being, defined or labeled, if you like, as mentally ill, which I can relate to because I can't connect the experience of this thing to the idea of being mentally ill. But of course, what happens is a lot of people then, kind of describe themselves as gifted, and that's just a new word for being a little different. It's very similar to the idea of being psychic. It's just the psychic is actually, again, then interpreting that to a role that they might play in terms of something they might actually do, whereas gifted is just a state of being, if you like, as an answer to the why me question. So really, if we can sort of think about the answers that we reach as answers to these questions, because these are the common ones that we ask. What happens in practice, of course, is that actually we're living with the implications of them. So, of course, that's the piece that we focus on, because really where the rubber hits the road is how it affects my life. So, of course, it's the implications that really matter. And, of course, what happens is that generally, you've seen in my other videos that actually what we're looking for is a good emotional sign-off. Otherwise, we'll come back to these questions. So if we find satisfactory answers pretty much to these things, we will then accept and live with, if you like. Whereas if we aren't emotionally satisfied in some way by these answers or rationalizations, which is all these why me question answers are, we will actually keep coming back to these. And then, of course, there are two other very obvious questions that we ask, which is where and when. And the point I want to make about them is that actually they become evidence in a way, because they become self-evident. So, for example, I first heard two people talking about what I was doing in my apartment. Okay, so the where and when was a particular day in my apartment when I was home alone. Of course, that was evidence that it was my neighbors. Of course, as the voices persisted, my impression of my neighbor's behavior changed. So, of course, that was just a pattern, a doing pattern, as I call it, that's developing in time, because we live our life kind of sequentially in time. So where and when are things that we start to interpret as evidence. And, of course, the important piece of that actually is that we start to anticipate it. So, for example, for the first 2 or 3 weeks, whatever it was, I heard my neighbors in my apartment. I didn't hear them outside the apartment. And of course, at some point, the phenomenology changed, so that I had the experience of voices beginning to follow me outside and wherever I was going. And of course, all that was happening there was they were shifting the location. And then, of course, starting to say, well, actually, there's no point in you logging in, to an email account in an internet store, because we can actually see what you're doing. And of course, what they're doing is they're getting ahead of me. They just now, and that's me sort of anticipating them. So, and then, so of course, we're anticipating their presence and their absence, and of course, their persistence. And of course, this is what this does, of course, is it starts, me asking questions then about myself. So this is me now projecting it forwards. I've sort of found, if you like, provisional answers to these questions. And of course, in amongst the implications, I'm asking questions about myself. I'm asking more questions about this thing as I observe its behavior changing. And of course, and I struggle to anticipate it. I'm asking lots more questions about this thing. But they kind of focus here on, well, okay, I don't know this. I don't know what it is. So why is it behaving like this? And of course, why is it behaving like this towards me? So of course, this is the piece I'm updating all the time, because I actually don't know, of course, what to plug in over here. And then, of course, what happens is I say, this is the stuff that becomes scary, particularly if this thing is behaving badly, then I project this into, into my day-to-day life as a scary thing. And of course, what happens here, just as another way for you to think about it, is that actually my answers to these questions are relatively slow. So I form sort of beliefs about them, seemingly logically, or at least I'm assessing the evidence in some way, even though the only evidence I really have is the behavior of this phenomenon. So it's phenomenology. Because it's unusual, I've slowed my processing down, if you like, and I'm forming these answers, sort of relatively slowly. And that's why I tend to hold them a bit more sort of strongly. But of course, what's happening is I am fast forwarding these into my day. And of course, this is the experience of it. And of course, as I assess the implications of it, of course, that's what's likely to make me paranoid often. This is often the case with these things, because I can't anticipate, what it's, when it's coming, and therefore what it means. So of course, I start to ask questions about those things. And then, of course, as time progresses, with this kind of thing, I'm kind of saying, well, where's this coming from? Of course, and I'm projecting it to my life. And of course, I start, I probably start asking questions again about what this thing is. And really, what's happening is that by this phenomenon, by perpetuating the mystery, if you like, of what this is, the lived experience of it is this multitude of beliefs and assessment of implications that arise from each comment, of course, that voices throw at you. Key point to make, of course, is that the provoked questions are much, much more predictable than the answers that we reach. And if you want to kind of simplify our understanding of, why we think about voices, this phenomenon the way that we do, is a good way to do that is to go back to the questions that we've asked in the first place, and then of course recognize that actually the answers that we have derived are based on the behavior of the phenomenon. We actually have no evidence other than the behavior of the phenomenon. We do not know what it is. We do not know what is at the other end of this handle, winding the handle on the jack in the box. Our beliefs are derived primarily from the behavior and our emotional response to it. Of course, that's what I'll show you in these next couple of slides. So what I want to do here is kind of isolate three, if you like, states of the phenomenology. As you would have seen from some of my other videos, that actually, for a lot of us, the phenomenology varies through time. But what I want to do is just pick three kind of states that relate more or less to the experiences of psychic, psychotic, and prophet, and just to give you, some kind of understanding. To give you different perspective on it. So the language that I'm using here is to kind of, I talk about how it engages the mind, so how it sort of kickstarts the processor. And I talk about three things. I talk about the mode, by which I primarily mean kind of one way, two way. It's the sort of observing and knowing thing that I mentioned in the hub slide in the beginning. The style, which I'm used to represent largely the body language, so the kind of overall behavior, of the phenomenology. And then, of course, the timing, because I say this thing acts very deliberately in your life to anticipate what it is that you're doing, because if it can do that, it can mess with your expectations. And of course, if our expectations are out of kilter, our reaction to it is much, much stronger. And of course, that then shapes everything that flows that. So by changing mode, style, and timing, voices can sort of engage us in a way that asserts relevance, which we then, of course, flow through in our processes to assess implications. So the three states that I'm going to talk about are this one. So imagine hearing just a sound out of context, don't know what it is, seeing something a little unusual, and of course, not actually being able to connect it to your environment. So you see it, you think, well, where did that come from? When you look again, and then you can't actually verify it, so you're kind of seeing this in some sort of way, or perhaps hearing, the sound of somebody's voice, or somebody calling your name, perhaps is by far the most common one. and of course, there not being anybody around particularly. But really what these things are doing is they are getting your attention in some way. And I just call them, for want of another description, they're kind of mixed snippets. And by mixed, I mean sort of multisensory. It might, as I say, be sound, a vision, language, a voice, or it might be temperature, feeling hot or cold, the air standing up on the back of your neck in a particular room in the house or somewhere, something along those lines. So of course, these are just little, what I would call extra sensory snippets. The second, category I want to talk about now is sort of imagine, voices, or two people talking sort of, but much closer. So just, near enough to be relevant, if you like, at the moment. And of course, what we do with that is we attach personalities to it. So in the way that I described in my first episode videos, I heard the sound of two people talking about what I was doing while I was home alone. I interpreted that as the neighbors. So that's what I mean, hearing the sound of two people talking, say sort of near enough. And of course, I start to attach personalities to them. So this is what we would call auditory verbal. So it's sound, but it's verbal. So it's introducing language. Of course, language is how we understand things. So, so that's just upping its relevance quotient, if you like. And then the third is, let's say, what is typically called, by researchers, the thought echo. And this is where, as I mentioned in my first episode videos, that the experience of the phenomenology is kind of almost like it sort of invades the mind, for want of another description, and makes your thoughts loud and audible. And suddenly you find that actually you're hearing your thoughts broadcast in the same bandwidth as the voices that you're hearing. Now, the implications of that are that my thoughts are actually shared in this bandwidth, so broadcast in some way. But of course, the effect of that is that my thoughts now have consequences. So what's happening from that sort of relevance point of view, if you like, along this scale from left to right, is that over here, these are snippets of data, for want of another description, that only become information if I plug them into a context, if you like. So I'm assimilating those as data and asking myself the question, does this mean anything? Does it have relevance? And then based on what's going on around me, I may actually accept it or dismiss it. So in kind of quite much the same way that we would assimilate data or information from our environment, as we sort of do from our senses. The only difference here, of course, is that actually I can't specifically connect it to my environment, but I'm experiencing it in, say, in an ordinary sort of sensory way. I just have no context for it. So, of course, I then kind of shift to saying, does this have any meaning or value? So I assimilate it as data in a relatively ordinary way. This one, because I say it's now sort of closer, if you like, and its language, it's more likely to have relevance. And I say typically it presents as relevant information. And this is the big kind of step to say that it's taking, is that the information presented now seems more relevant. And as I mentioned in the first episode videos, I heard the sound of two people talking about what I was doing while I was home alone, which meant that somebody could see what I was doing. So it presented as relevant information because I was home alone. People shouldn't have been able to see into my apartment. It had to be, of course, say from the fire escape and therefore the neighbors. But that's what I mean. So by presenting as relevant, I've interpreted it and I've plugged personalities into the other end of it. Whereas this one over here is, has changed the game completely, because my thoughts now have consequences. So what you recognize here is this interaction between some entity, unknown, although I say it later on started to assert what it was or who it was, but it's now engaging with my thoughts and what voices say, as the two sides of a coin of a conversation, and a conversation that actually has consequences. So this is the very, very big difference in terms of the experience just of the phenomenology, is of course that, from left to right, this, this is much, much more invasive. Over here, I might feel that I have some sort of sense of control, because I'm experiencing it kind of more as a sensory thing. Whilst I may or may not be able to sort of call it up or something, I can certainly dismiss it, easily or not. I can actually decide what to do with it. That's the thing, what I mean by assimilating it here as data. Here, of course, so when I first heard the sound of two people talking about what I was doing, the logical thing to do was to interpret it in some way, and I reached the conclusion that it had to be my neighbors. It was only after I'd been to the doctor who described, that I was, experiencing auditory hallucinations, that the idea of dismissing it even occurred to me. And of course, by then voices were, in this mode actually with me already, and of course I couldn't ignore them, because every thought I had consequences. So even thinking I'm going to dismiss it, is just, becomes a meaningless kind of idea, because this thing is engaging with your thinking. So that's what I mean by your thoughts actually now have, your thoughts have consequences, and of course you can't ignore it, you can't dismiss it. The best you can do is reject it. And of course, and you don't realize that, you don't realize that at first. So relevance is one thing, invasiveness is another kind of idea. And of course, as I mentioned, it comes with a style. So, not sort of what voices say. So my voices, for example, they can say I love you in a way that kind of sounds okay. And they can say I love you in a way that means completely the opposite. And of course, that is simply by changing the tone of voice. So this whole thing, of course, is it has what I call body language. So in the same way that ordinary communication, has this very large non-verbal component that's true, of this interaction with this phenomenology. And of course, I say this really, really sort of confuses the issue. Until you recognize that it's just body language, and gives you a way to compartmentalize it and deal with it differently. And of course, what's happening is that over here, these bits of information are just suggestive, if you like. So they're bits of information that come into your aware mind in some way. And of course, so it's information. The reason I call it suggestive is it's prompted in or presented in a slightly unusual way. But of course, I say isn't aggressive in the way that it's inserted, if you like, into your aware mind. Whereas over here, as I say, every piece of information from these voices is very much, inserted into the mind in a very assertive way. And of course, over here, voices may actually, of course, be claiming, who they are and who you are, as I'll show you. And then, of course, the other layer that I want to add to this is remembering, of course, that our mind is predictive, that we experience things in a sense of time. So the timing of when this happens, of course, is very, very important, because that's what affects what we expect, and of course, what we expect affects our reaction to it. And so this timing has these many components. It's presence. So once I've been exposed to it, I'm aware of its presence. I know it's there. And of course, I only have to experience it 2 or 3 times to start asking the question, well, when is it going to happen again? So of course, there's this kind of concept of absence, which is a form of presence, because I'm anticipating when it will actually come back again, because it's that unusual. And of course, then there's the question of, well, how often does it happen? Which is this kind of frequency, which starts to tie into the idea of when and where. And then, of course, there are other kind of timing type things that relate, as I say, for example, to body language. So one of the things I mentioned that's particularly significant here is voices are able to change their tempo, and even sort of tone of voice, basically to change the urgency of the piece of information that is being presented. And of course, that experience of urgency changes the significance of it. And of course, what all this is doing is leading us to sort of start asking the question, when and where is this going to happen? So we've built this evidentiary pattern based on when we do experience it, of course, we start to predict that or project it forwards. And then, of course, we start to anticipate it. So, of course, this is the anticipation because we don't know what to expect. We kind of start to try and anticipate it. And, of course, if it's doing its own thing, of course, we struggle to anticipate it. And, of course, our expectations can often become fearful. And of course, that's what leads to paranoia and, of course, then panic when it arrives at an unexpected time. So the words that I'm using, for these three are, I'm calling this one over here, that, the mode is one way, so this is a piece of information that I'm receiving, if you like. The implications, though, of it are outbound. I'm kind of comfortable that actually it's only relevant, when I make it relevant, and I make it relevant, of course, typically if it's as a psychic, it's for someone else. This one in the middle, is sort of your mode one way. So I'm hearing now, sort of language. And of course, as soon as it starts talking about me, then the implications are inbound. So that it then, of course, matters to me. And over here, the mode is now two-way, where it's what I'm calling sort of forced telepathic. So the implications are now going in both directions. So the implications are obviously, for me, it's inbound in that sense. But of course, now voices are claiming that my thoughts have consequences, not just for me, but for others. So of course, it's this kind of telepathic thing that sort of creates this concept where actually my thoughts now have consequences. So this is much more suggestive. This is actually much more assertive. So what this bottom row here is about is how the phenomenology actually gets attention. So my predictive sense of how it's getting attention, if you like. This sort of next line is about how it asserts relevance and significance in my life. So over here, it's becoming relevant. Over here, the fact that my thoughts are shared and have consequences has suddenly become hugely significant in my life, because obviously I can't stop thinking. And of course, voices, not only that, voices are provoking my thinking. So if every thought has consequences, of course, that can, of course, be very, very scary. And this is what makes thinking scary sometimes, when you hear voices. And of course, this is when people talk about racing thoughts. This is voices provoking you. Our mind is sort of fast forwarding implications. And of course, that's the experience, if you like, of racing thoughts. This middle row, the pictures, is the way that the phenomenology or the phenomenon presents information in the aware mind. So this is how it brings the information into focus. So this is a little unusual, comes into my focus. I can choose whether or not to assimilate it, in some way and integrate it into my thinking. Over here, it's presented as language. If it's talking about me, it's much more relevant. So of course, that comes into my focus. And over here, it's actually kind of turned the tables, and my thoughts are now in focus, whether I like it or not. And every thought I have has consequences. So these seem like relatively small shifts in phenomenology. You'll gather from that actually the significance for me and my interpretation or a prediction of that in terms of consequences in my life, the implications, of course, change quite dramatically on those little turns in phenomenology. So this line then, this kind of invasiveness and the body language that sort of go together, they are the sort of, they are sort of things that signal intent. So as this thing becomes more invasive, more aggressive, as it changes tone, if you like, the body language, of course, it can kind of signal intent before it even says anything. And of course, that's how it creates a scene or a scenario, in which the information that is thrown at you, is received in a hyper-vigilant, hyper-aware state of mind that then maximizes the strength of the signal when it comes into focus. And then, of course, this sort of top line, the timing, is a way of creating uncertainty, which is the same idea of exaggerating hypervigilance and hyper-awareness. And of course, this whole thing then gives you an idea of how voices have a large number of variables that they can actually change, to which which can create different kinds of experiences. And of course, a lot of the experiences rely on our cognitive bias, if you like. So the comments, the comments I've made about how this is changing your awareness or your hypervigilance, if your attitude towards it, of course, is positive, and you then receive a signal in that sort of frame of mind, it's going to confirm your belief in the idea that you're a psychic. Whereas over here, if as in my case, voices asserted to be God and the devil and an evil God and declared that I am the second coming, that was them, exaggerating their power, making me a pawn in their game, and of course that experience of it can be particularly unexciting and particularly frightening. So what I want to do here is actually, just put that in motion a little and kind of just show you, so that was the static picture, if you like. So now I'm going to just do a similar kind of thing. I'm just going to do it sort of progressively and show you some sort of shades of gray in between those, those sort of those three states, and then kind of show you how actually the phenomenology leads you towards experiences of being, as I say, a psychic, where I view myself as having powers, if you like, or a power to access this other world that other people don't have, to being psychotic or mad, as we might call it, and towards being a prophet, where now you're actually chosen by a power on high, and I use that language rather than a higher power. So of course, this of course is is the psychotic experience, where I'm asking all these what the belief questions, whereas over here as a psychic, I'm providing some mystical or mysterious answers for someone who sort of comes to me. If voices are sort of talking very much about me and my life and getting in the way of it, I'm going to be asking what the belief questions. And then of course, if voices come along and say, you're the perfect man for the job, you are the second coming, and will you rewrite the Bible? Of course, then voices have actually chosen you, to be the second coming, whether you like it or not, is my experience of it. And of course, what they've done is they've shouldered you with these extra responsibilities, which is their way of exaggerating the consequences of your thinking. And of course, that's the experience of being a prophet, which is not much fun when you're being a prophet to an evil God who wants to just impose his ideas on you and the rest of the world and make you responsible for it. And that's just by assertion rather than based on any evidence, of course. So so before doing the kind of gradual movement through those kinds of styles, I want to just kind of remind you here that actually the mind is predictive. So recognize that when voices are making a comment, what the mind is doing is sort of processing that quickly to assess the implications. So what you've got to recognize, of course, is that the mind is predictive. So it's doing that processing. It's going from now to what this means. And of course, I'm asking the question, well, where is this information coming from? Is it the neighbors? Is it God? Is it the devil? Is it an evil God? Is it grandma? Is it aliens? I say, so is it multiples? We have all these ideas about what's at the other end of this jack-in-the-box winding the handle. And of course, what my brain is doing is I'm processing that information and projecting it out there, and kind of I'm in the middle of it. And of course, if voices can exaggerate the consequences of me being in the middle of it by making my thoughts consequential, then of course the experience is much, much more severe. So of course, this is then, I say, based on the idea that there is this hub that connects the voices. Of course, I'm experiencing this thing. I don't know what it is, but voices are claiming that it does connect me to other humans, and of course, and to them, and they can redistribute the information, my thoughts, for example, in any way, of course, that I like. But by introducing this kind of otherworldly thing, they're claiming this other space, and of course, they then start to say, well, they set the rules, and of course, because they then have asserted this space as being dominant over the real world that kind of start to assert the rules in my world and tell me what I can and can't do, or what I can and can't think. And of course, they confuse the issue by sometimes saying I love you while behaving rather badly in general. So although I hear voices in the background, kind of saying I love you in time, you just don't know what's what really. So I simply say if you so. And of course, these kinds of ideas about how how good or bad it is in your head is about your thinking is a sort of knowing comment on me and my thoughts. So the sort of observing my thoughts becomes a much more knowing kind of idea. And of course, by then kind of, because voices are observing every thought and commenting on every thought, they sort of then make these claims about what I do and don't understand. And of course, because they're imposing this otherworldly thing, where they're trying to sort of set the rules, they can just claim that I do or don't understand in this other space. And of course, the only evidence that I have to work with is the behavior of voices, or the phenomenology. And then, of course, they start to influence my prediction of implications by starting to sort of make predictions and kind of start to say, well, this man is going to, which of course this man could be me or someone else. And of course, while they're waiting, because your experience of this soon becomes that actually they can't do any of this stuff about who is doing what, where, and when. What they have to do is actually wait for stuff to happen in your life, and then confuse your reading of that, your perception of it. So while they're hanging around, they kind of start to pester you and kind of say, well, please don't do this, or please do that. And sit down and turn on the TV as if I should give a darn about them. And of course the whole idea that I'm actually their entertainment. I often say to them, I think I am their TV. And of course they use that whole idea of observing to claim just that. So just bear in mind as I go through this thing, of kind of showing little nuances of how the phenomenology shifts, that what's happening is sort of each comment is a fully formed idea. It presents a context, even if it doesn't have one. So, it says, Greg, boy, you can't do that. That actually, I react to that and saying, well, who are you to say so? Of course I can do that. So it creates a context in terms of where the context is just me and what I can and can't do. That engages my brain and my story. So it engages it gets my attention emotionally. And of course, by predicting, it's getting involved in my story, and that's my predictive reaction response. And of course, that's happening fast. And of course, the implications of that are uncertain. And of course, voices easily make that extreme by claiming to be, the devil, say, or a demon, or anything else, that has influence, in your life. They can actually make those implications more extreme in the mind. And then simply by persisting and provoking and throwing these comments at you, they create these endless permutations, as I mentioned, on an earlier slide. And of course, because this is happening quite fast and your mind is in fast mode, assessing these implications, the little nuances of as this thing shifts are kind of lost in the sort of in complexity and confusion. So same three modes. I'm just going to do them in a slightly different view, if you like. So imagine just hearing a sound out of context, or perhaps that sort of strange feeling, hair standing up on the back of your neck, seeing something unusual, or hearing perhaps, as I say, the sound of somebody in just a kind of snippet, if you like. Engages our senses in particular ways. So sight is much more kind of likely to engage our view of the future. Language is much more inclined to lead us towards giving it meaning. And of course, depending on what the language is, what the words are, it can be made much, much more specific. So if, for example, I see a picture that looks like Mary, then I've had a vision of the Mother Mary. Of course, so I give that meaning in a particular way. And of course, because our mind is predictive, we're much, much more likely to give this meaning in the future. Of course, we're going to connect it to history. So a vision of the Mother Mary, for example, obviously would have a connection, particularly if you're a Catholic, in your history. If you're not a Catholic, you wouldn't even recognize it, as Mary, for example. So our history, of course, has a context, but we translate it in terms of our future. So, of course, what's happening here is to say when I'm experiencing just these sort of snippets, particularly if I'm experiencing, these two over here, I am led towards, interpreting it in the future with meaning in some way. And of course, in my answer to the question, what is it? I'm answering it by kind of saying, I see something that you don't. Therefore, I know something, if you like, that you don't. And of course, I start to answer the question, well, how is this happening, with the answer that, well, I'm gifted, I'm clairvoyant, I'm clairaudient. Which I say clairvoyant, clairaudient are literally just descriptions. I see things and hear things that you don't. And of course, when I ask the question, well, why and why me? I start to say, well, I'm psychic, and I have this extra sense, and then as a psychic, the why me? I have a role that, or I can play a role in society, if you like. That's a little different. And then, of course, the where, when of this becomes something that I now actually start to seek it out. And then I might perform some kind of ritual to create a state of mind in which I am more receptive or more able to receive these little snippets of information. And of course, I may go into a trance. I may organize a seance where I'm lighting candles and setting up the room in a particular way, or I may dance with music, drumming, rhythm, something along these lines. So we have lots of interpretations of rituals in which, the psychic or the shaman creates the conditions under which they are more amenable to communicating with this other world. So we do lots of things to let this phenomenon know that we're ready to receive, if you like. And of course, it may or may not happen, depending, of course, sort of on the circumstances. And then, of course, we rationalize this. But of course, what's happening over here is that we've created a relationship with the phenomenon that, if we have interpreted it as I am psychic, our emotional response to it is a good one. So it's ticking other boxes on our soothe system. We're not seeing it as threatening. We're kind of saying, okay, I'm psychic, I'm special, I'm gifted. And of course, from a drive point of view, we're saying it's actionable under certain circumstances, and I can help others with it. And of course, the reason I say help is, for me, this is an entirely unethical thing, because it has no provenance. There is no code of ethics for being a psychic. It's nothing, it's not something we can manage the quality of. So I'm sorry, I take an extreme, I wouldn't say an extreme view. I take a pretty, for me, rational view that actually this thing has no provenance, and we should be cautious of it. But of course, what's happening here is it's easily translated to the idea that I'm gifted. And of course, what happens then is I generalize that belief. I have extra senses. I receive messages from, and of course, what I then start to do is say, my dreams have meaning. And of course, I start to interpret these little signs and signals and things in some way, because my emotional experience of it is comfortable. That's okay. What happens then, in the kind of the next phase is this thing now. So it comes a little bit closer. Let's say I hear the sound of voices talking about someone, let's say, in the distance. So here it's still kind of okay. I might still interpret it in this sort of same vein. And if someone came to see me as a psychic, or if, say, my tribe came and asked a question of me as a shaman, I would interpret this in that sort of context and recognize, of course, that this is just an interpretation of a snippet of information in the context of a question that somebody has presented to me. Zero provenance, and of course, we've given it relevance just by organizing it in that way. So let's say now that actually this voice comes a little closer to home, something that sounds a little familiar, and I might kind of say, okay, this is perhaps my grandmother. This is a photograph of one of my lovely grandmothers. And of course, there are many cultures that believe we're in touch with our ancestors. And of course, that would mean grandma, grandpa, in particular, certainly from younger age, parents later on, family that passed on really. And of course, this is still, if this voice behaves in a way that is consistent with grandma, then of course that is still a comfortable belief. And then I want to show you now how one little nuance changes that. Sorry, I'm one step ahead of myself here. What's happened over here is that from a relationship with the phenomenon, I now have a relationship with a persona. I might be, declaring it known on the basis of some similarity to grandma, but in reality, it's an unknown. So at least sort of ask yourself the question: why don't we all hear grandma? Why would it be a cultural thing? That makes no sense at all. We're all human. There's no reason, why one culture should be more predisposed, to hearing grandma than any other culture. It's entirely illogical, so it has no provenance at all. This is just us giving it meaning and expression. So I say this is a relationship with a persona unknown that we're attaching a personality to make it known at best. And then, of course, as this thing comes a little closer still and starts to talk about me as a person, or about what I'm doing, about me as a person. So in my first episode video, I first heard voices talking about what I was doing, and a day or two later they started talking about me as a person, stuff they wouldn't have known unless they'd been observing me for much longer than I was through hearing voices. And then, of course, as they started to follow me outside the apartment, and we're then talking about what I was doing and what I might do and where I was going, all they were doing was moving back and forth in time in my life, and of course changing, shifting this idea of observing to knowing, simply by moving up and down the time scale of my life. So the first nuance was, suddenly voices are talking about me. I'm trying to attach a personality to the other end of it. Originally, at first, it was the neighbors. When voices started following me outside the apartment, it could no longer be the neighbors. By now, the behavior was aggressive and bullying and following me, spying on me. The answer I was likely to reach was certainly not going to be grandma, and certainly not going to be a friendly one. So, of course, I'm saying I don't know what this is, but the answer I'm plugging in is definitely not a good one. And those nuances happen very, very subtly. Voices suddenly talking about me, talking about what I was doing, talking about what I had done in the past, talking about what I was doing and about to do, moving up and down the time frame. And suddenly this thing is interfering in my life, and my privacy has been violated. My emotional response to it is unpleasant, and the beliefs I'm liable to reach about it are unpleasant. So the answers I'm plugging in to this question are not friendly at all. And of course, I'm observed by something, I don't know what it is, and my mind is processing that quickly to kind of say, well, this is what it means. And of course, voices are talking about me, and of course, I now start to think about myself and what I'm doing, about who I am. And of course, I've now formed this new relationship with myself just by thinking about myself. And of course, voices come along now and engage your thoughts and sort of bring your thoughts into focus, very much so, by creating this sort of thought echo. And of course, by exaggerating that, by asserting that my thoughts have consequences, not just for me, but for others. And I now have this much, much more aggressive and invasive interaction, of course, with this phenomenon, which then, of course, distorts my relationships with everything. Of course, not just with, not just with myself, but of course now, because everything I think about has consequences, I say this thing is now distorting my relationships with and to absolutely everything in my life, certainly everything I think about. And of course, this is why I say it's distorting my relationships thoughtfully, because voices are now provoking my thinking in particular directions. Simply by throwing a comment at me, they're bringing up a context. So the moment they can either start talking about people in my life, for example, my relationships, or the moment I start to think about people in my life, literally, for example, I start to think about who might I get help from when voices are being aggressive. Of course, that mere thought, the thinking about who I might actually get help from is now actually shared with this phenomenon. So I no longer have a strategy. I no longer have the ability to plan, to think about anything without voices actually knowing my every thought. And of course, this is a much, much more distressing experience. And of course, as I think about people in my life, about my world, about what I'm doing, about my future, of course, everything in that space is being distorted, and it's pretty easy for voices to make the world that I live in a scary place, simply by saying that that man in the street over there is doing this, or is thinking that, and that it's unsafe. And of course, they lead me towards a dim view, of myself, of the world that I live in. And it's very, very easy for voices to create an experience that is filled with paranoia. And of course, all that's happening is they're doing is getting me into a threatened state of mind. And in that state of mind, the belief I'm going to form about what is at the other end of this jack-in-the-box winding the handle is something aggressive with power to influence my life. And then, of course, what they do is exaggerate that power by introducing this other world. So whereas we're warming to the idea of having a connection to ancestors, voices are then asserting ideas about what they are in this otherworldly space that they are then claiming as having dominance over this world by claiming to be God, the devil, aliens, God's messengers of some sort, jinn, angels, demons, the voice of knowledge, the voice of wisdom, the voice of this, that, or the other. So, of course, these are just characters at the other end of the handle of this jack-in-the-box. We warm to this one. Voices are now being much more assertive, at this end of the scale, about what that is, to exaggerate their power. And then I say, as in my case, and I'm not the only one, voices, of course, then came along and declared that I am the second coming, as you saw earlier on the slide. And of course, what that does now is, of course, they've changed my identity, if you like, for me, whether I like it or not. But of course, what they're doing is they're now declaring, my ideas to be theirs. They can disagree with me, agree with me. They can tell me what to do, or so they claim, tell me what not to do. I've now become a pawn by declaring me to be the second coming. I've now become a pawn in their game. And of course, they use that to exaggerate the consequences of every thought. And of course, this is pretty dramatic. And of course, is allowed to drive you crazy, quite literally. And it definitely will make you kind of psychotic. But it's all based on this idea now that your thoughts, everything about yourself is shared in this otherworldly space via this hub. And of course, voices have now put me in the middle as the second coming of resolving this kind of problem of this battle between good and evil that's playing out in this other world and in this world. And of course, in the other world, it's this fellow God, the devil, that is in the middle of this hub, slicing and dicing information and sending it wherever they want to and editing it whatever way they want to. And of course, a variation on that is that there are plenty of people who feel, where voices have claimed to be someone in the CIA or some other, or Mossad or some other secret service agency, that is sort of, acting on behalf of powerful figures on the planet. And of course, as someone who, just literally as a thinking person, you're a threat to this, whatever entity they decide they want to be. And of course, they're just playing off this relationship between yourself and themselves by exaggerating their power and making you the problem and sometimes the solution. Of course, to encourage and discourage, and by encouraging and discouraging, they're exaggerating your emotions. And then by changing a little nuance like this, suddenly, your pleasant emotions suddenly flick to the paranoid emotions associated with the same theme that they're bugging you with at a particular time. So of course, all that's happening over here is we're finding answers to the same questions. So what, I'm now, I'm asking, I'm reaching an answer that's saying someone or something can see and hear me in my question of how voices have this remote vantage point from which they're observing and knowing. So of course, the answers I reach are something like telepathy or voice to skull technology, or remote viewing, or that these things are multiples, participating in my life, in my mind. These are all just kind of hows, which are often confused with a what who, at the end of this thing winding the handle. And of course, I then start to ask the question why, and because the behavior is bad and torturing and cruel, they are obviously against me. And of course, I might come up with a because, and of course, the because could be anything based on, the answers I've reached up here. So it could be the CIA that's put me in the middle of this conspiracy theory. It could be a demon. We come up with all sorts of answers. And then, of course, we start to anticipate the where and when. And of course, that, of course, is a sign of voices' intention to sort of undermine, of course, what we're doing. But of course, this where, when thing and this observing and knowing is the stuff that we're interpreting as foreknowledge. So we're interpreting this as voices actually knowing what's about to happen. They don't. They are relying on our confirmation bias to give us signals that confuse us into believing they have foreknowledge of what's about to happen. And it's based, as I say, on our experience of this thing as knowing what I know, because it's interacting with my thinking. And we then start to say, well, okay, if they know what I know, do they know what someone else knows? So when they claim that so-and-so is thinking this, or going to do this, so when this person in the street that I encounter is going to attack me, if that's what voices are actually saying, it's based on the idea that they know my thoughts, therefore they might know the thoughts of this person in the street. And I'm therefore on the lookout, and all I have to do is see that person move in an unusual way. And I feel in a way that I think is unusual, that I then perceive as threatening. And that's just my cognitive bias working against me, because voices have made me fearful, and I interpret in cautious mode because I feel threatened down here. I interpret that in cautious mode as threatening. And of course, I start to respond to it that way, or avoid it, whatever that is. And of course, what happens here now is I have this this phenomenon has imposed an abusive relationship on me, over here. And of course, that may take that a step further and declare me to be the second coming, or a participant in some conspiracy theory with the CIA, where I'm actually chosen to do something or play a particular role in that experience. So clearly over here, this is much, much more distressing. And of course, voices can make it much, much more distressing. And this experience is psychotic, whereas over here it's psychic. And of course, it's just variations on a theme where this whole kind of concept of observing very soon becomes translated, is translated as knowing. And of course, knowing is easily then predicted, projected into intervening in life. So very much over here, where voices have changed my identity for me, if you like, just declared me to be the second coming. I didn't choose that. Voices decided that I am going to be the second coming, whether I like it or not. So even as I rejected them, they just said, well, we don't care what you think, you are the second coming. And of course, the fact that I objected to evil as having any relevance, of course, was just a stick that they could actually wave at me. And of course, that was the mode to kind of say, well, actually, we're intervening, of course, not just in your life, but in terms of who you are. And so, of course, but the trouble is, say, on this side, we're experiencing this as okay, whereas actually for me, it's completely, it's definitely not okay. It's entirely unethical. It's not transparent. We, on a purely ethical basis, I dismiss that as being useful to us at all. And of course, unfortunately, what's happening is voices are abusing our optimistic desire to believe in a life hereafter. And of course, we are unfortunately gullibly actually asking this phenomenon to intervene or to intercede. So culturally, I'm in South Africa at the moment. You can look at an ad in any one of the newspapers, and you will see adverts for traditional healers, so-called, or shamans or witch doctors or whatever label you give them. Of course, what they're doing is they're offering things like magic wallets. They're offering to help you win your court case. They're offering to help you when you win a lost lover back. They're offering to help bring you fortune through a magic wallet. And of course, all you have to do is take this herb or whatever, or pay me lots of money, or in some very, very severe cases, bring me the head of a white child or Indian child or whatever, and quite literally you get this kind of stuff happening. So this stuff can be terribly, terribly abused. And of course, religion, the real religions are just a variation on that theme, where voices have sort of created these experiences, claim to be God. And of course, when we've acted on that, so go and kill every man, woman, and child in that village to claim your promised land, for example, to me is the origin of what we still struggle with as Middle East conflict, with three conflicting religions, having origin in a very small kind of area, sort of on a crossroad of trade routes and things, just to be designed to perpetuate conflict between us, particularly when we act on it. And I say, and we are gullibly actually asking it to intercede. So, this fellow, who is neither God nor devil, is just some strange phenomenon, has created a scenario or a setup, in which the general population is, working with cutesy beliefs in a life hereafter, accepting the idea of psychic powers, whereas actually the translation of all of that into real life is actually not good for us. And certainly for people who experience this thing over here, these things exacerbate the experience and make it far worse and of course, far more intense. So just to summarize then, I'm focusing here on the kind of what the bleep psychotic side is actually that these two forms of phenomenology that most of us who are experiencing this as distressing are experiencing, is this idea of sort of hearing voices, when what I'm doing is I'm attaching characters to the other end of it, either in this other world or in this world, either way, based on the behavior of voices, the beliefs that I'm reaching about what this thing is, are things that have power because it's unusual. It's imposing stuff on me. It definitely has an effect on my life, an effect in my life, which is an emotionally unpleasant and distressing experience. And based on that, I'm liable to, formulate beliefs about what this thing and what it's capable of, that are certainly not good for me or even for us. And of course, just by shifting the phenomenology and kind of literally lifting my thoughts up into this space, where thoughts and voice, I hear my own thoughts and voices in the same space, that hearing my thoughts brings my attention to my thoughts, and my thoughts now have consequences that voices then, of course, claim are magnificent and or terrible. And of course, that's what's creating the the mania and paranoia. And of course, the power of this thing appears to grow from this idea that it's observing. Of course, it can see what I'm doing wherever I am. That piece, I think, is pretty straightforward. Of course, that then is escalated to being all seeing, all knowing, and all omnipotent. But of course, all of this over here, is all nonsense. It's based on this simple experience that this thing is observing and commenting on. And of course, this aggressive, invasive experience of bringing your thoughts into focus, in this case. So of course, what voices are doing is from this vantage point, they're creating an advantage point in which they assert power over us in this relationship between self and whatever belief we form about what it is. So either by suggestion, by interpretation, by creating a vision of something that appears to be Mary, for example, pure suggestion, or by over here by interpretation. You know, so I heard two people talking about what I was doing at home. I logically interpreted that as my neighbors, you know, and then for a couple of weeks at least, you know, I thought my neighbors were not very nice characters at all. But of course, this could be somebody who, you know, who has abused me in the past or whatever, you know, and is mobile. And of course, if it's mobile, then that has implications in my life. And of course, what this one has done is by asserting to be God, the devil, aliens, multiples, you know, all of these things, it's exaggerated the power, or tried to exaggerate the power by claiming omnipotence, and of course has created confusion just by shifting these little frames of reference with small nuance in the phenomenology. And really all that's happening is in this mode, voices are provoking with interference. It's like poking at you with a stick or a spear because they find your soft spots. You know, so if you've been abused in the past, those are things you will reasonably, you know, quite reasonably be sensitive to emotionally. And if voices can jab those things, your reaction will be much stronger. And of course, you're much, much more likely to believe that this voice is in fact your past abuser. Whereas over here, the provocation actually is of intervention. So this is voices claiming to be able to interfere, of course, intervene actually in everything that you do. And of course, you know, my voice is declared as total war, Greggy boy. If that were true, hey, I wouldn't be here. But of course, you know, we've been exposed to this thing for thousands of years. And of course, the problems have arisen when we have acted on what voices say and claim to be. So what we've got to do is reject all of that. And of course, that's really, for me, what the summary here is about, is that actually this thing is phenomenally deceptive. And really that what happens is simply because it's unknown, it's different. It's provoking these what the bleep questions. So from our processing point of view, the stimulus comes along, it's unusual. I ask a question about what it is, I form a belief about what it is that's at the other end of this thing churning the handle. But of course, I don't know what to expect of it because it's demonstrating intent. So of course, what this is doing is it's shunting me back here to trying to identify this thing in some way. I'm populating my identity frame of reference of what this thing is based on its behavior, which is usually bad, although it's often a mix of good and bad. But of course, what I found, you know, particularly, you know, with the kind of loving voices, is what they did was it trained me to look to this phenomenon for help, because you know, I was experiencing the torture and the bullying from this kind of space. You know, when you hear these loving voices, my brain is literally shifting there and kind of somehow asking this thing for help, even though that help, of course, is not coming. So, of course, the only evidence that we have of this thing is, as in experience of it, in fact, all of us, is its behavior. When I say all of us, you know, for me, it's the direct experience of its behavior. For you, typically, your interpretations are based on my behavior when I'm responding to it, which is usually this, you know, overflow of extreme emotions. And of course, that's what's leading us to give it power that it doesn't have, because we're seeing it as distressing. So we're more likely to create, you know, beliefs in power and influence and in meanness, really. So based on the evidence, based on its behavior, we're developing an emotional response to it that shapes our beliefs. And of course, we start to expect bad behavior from it. And of course, then what we do is we actually get more and see more bad behavior. So we're actually getting more bad behavior from the phenomenon. We're projecting that into our life, into our everyday life. And of course, we then start to form negative beliefs about life. And of course, all that's happening is voices have trapped us in this circle in which we build emotional sensitivity to the themes on which voices are provoking us. The spear that they're poking us with, you know, or the sore spot in me that voices are poking is the stuff that I'm going to become particularly sensitive to. And by, you know, typically they're escalating the problem to something bigger than I can solve. And of course, that's how they just perpetuate this continuous provocation of kind of hitting your sore spots or your weak spots, or trying to destroy your strengths. You know, for example, for me, so my experience, if you like, of the voices declaring me the second coming was voices trying to target my strengths and actually make them a problem for me. And of course, to some degree, they were successful for a period. And of course, what they're doing, what voices are then doing, you know, is of course, as this kind of thing shifts, and they become assertive, they start to say, well, okay, I'm God. Whereas they say, we're actually, this is the stuff you want to believe in, or lots of people rather, not necessarily you, lots of people do and want to believe in this character being a good character, whereas in fact he, she, it, whatever it is neither one or the other, but the experience of it is this character, of course, which is a not very pleasant experience at all. And of course, my argument against this character is that actually there should never have been a need for this character. And of course, the only reason we accept the idea of good and evil is that we can only live with that in our heads or our minds until we're actually confronted with it. Once you're confronted with this thing, you have no choice but to kind of say, actually, no way, they're not in my life. And of course, the way that I did that in the experience of it is kind of say to these voices, well, you can't be the neighbors, and God and the devil and the CIA and the aliens and Mossad and whoever else, multiples, all these other things that they try to be. And actually, you'll be whatever I decide you are. And of course, that's how God became squealy. And of course, to solve this problem of not knowing what to expect, the moment he opened his, started speaking, I would literally just cut him off at the knees. And of course, once you do that and you stop this flow towards implications, then of course these two characters can become completely ridiculous, based merely on their presence. What on earth are they hanging around in my life for? All this time, just provoking me. So of course they became ridiculous. So this one became, ridiculous as squealy, in a drab olive suit with a pink bikini. So really, you've seen this slide before on the phenomenology ones. This, the Jack in the Box is of course the problem. And of course, what it's doing is it's shaping our story for us. And in fact, the world that we live in. And of course, what we need to do is if we, interrupt it, if we reject it, we can actually reimagine our own story. So of course, my approach, as I say, is to recognize how we can do that. And of course, I go a step further and say we can actually, create our own story, not just individually, but globally, by recognizing that actually this thing has caused problems for us, particularly, of course, when we've acted on it. So thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Of course, what I'd like to do is keep as much of this as possible free for people who hear voices. To do that, I have this fundraiser on crowdrise.com called Someone You Know Hears Voices. If you'd like to comment on this on social media, please use #MadSense. If you're a researcher and we'd like to work together on some studies on phenomenology, kind of using those three sort of static pictures, if you like, plus the flow as doing a study on phenomenology, you can reach me on my email. I would very much enjoy that. And then as before, there are plenty of other players in the field studying the phenomenology and the experience of it that also work on donations. So thank you for listening.